April 17, 2026, oil prices fell off a cliff, 12% in a single afternoon. And the reason behind that collapse may be the most consequential development in the Middle East since the war began. But here is the question you need to keep in mind as we go through all of this. Iran just reopened the Strait of Hormuz. So why is the United States Navy still blockading it? To understand what happened today, and more importantly what it actually means, we need to go back to the night of February 28th, because nothing that occurred this afternoon makes any sense without understanding the 47 days that preceded it. On the evening of February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated military operation against Iran. The operation, codenamed Epic Fury, involved nearly 900 strikes in a 12-hour window. It targeted missile infrastructure, air defense systems, command and control facilities, and in the opening minutes, the compound of Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei. By the time Iranian state media confirmed his death the following morning, the world had fundamentally changed. Khamenei, who had ruled the Islamic Republic for 37 years, was gone, and his family, including his daughter, son-in-law, and grandchild, died alongside him. The broader context here matters. In January of 2026, Iranian security forces had cracked down violently on the largest domestic protest movement since the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The death toll ran into the thousands. The Trump administration responded with a sweeping military buildup in the region, the largest American force projection in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. Nuclear negotiations were underway, and then, while those negotiations were still technically ongoing, the strikes began. Secretary of State Marco Rubio later disclosed that the initial American involvement was partly triggered by Israel's intent to strike Iranian leadership unilaterally, which would have placed American forces in the region in immediate jeopardy regardless. Whether you accept that framing or not, the result was the same. A war that nobody had publicly declared was suddenly, irreversibly underway. Iran's response was swift and broad. Hundreds of ballistic missiles and thousands of drones were launched against targets in Israel, American military bases in Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. NATO infrastructure was struck. A British airbase on Cyprus was hit by a drone. And Iran did something that energy analysts had long feared but never expected to see. It closed the Strait of Hormuz. Now, it is worth pausing here to make sure everyone understands what the Strait of Hormuz actually is. It is, in the most literal sense, the jugular vein of the global energy system. At its narrowest point, it is just 34 kilometers wide. Through that narrow corridor, before February 28th, approximately 20 million barrels of oil passed every single day. That represents roughly 20% of all the world's seaborne oil supply. Saudi Arabia ships through it. Iraq ships through it. Qatar's liquefied natural gas exports pass through it. The United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Bahrain all depend on it. In 2024, an estimated 84% of crude oil moving through the strait was destined for Asian markets. China alone received a third of its total oil supply through that waterway. When Iran closed it, the International Energy Agency's director, Fatih Birol, called it, and I want to be precise with this characterization, the worst energy shock the world has ever seen. More severe, he said, than the oil crises of the 1970s and the Ukraine war combined. Oil prices that sat around $72 a barrel before the war surged toward $150 at the physical market level. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas estimated that the closure was lowering global GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points in the second quarter of 2026 alone. The IMF cut its global growth forecast and warned that the world was drifting toward an adverse scenario. Countries that relied on Gulf energy began scrambling. Iraq started shutting down the Rumaila oil field because tankers could not leave. Qatar warned that other Gulf producers might be forced to declare force majeure and halt exports entirely. The cascading consequences were real, immediate, and deeply painful for the most vulnerable economies in the world. But the crisis did not stay frozen in one place. Over the weeks that followed, it evolved in ways that are critical to understanding what happened today. And there is a thread that runs through all of it that most of the mainstream coverage has not adequately connected. That thread involves a question that we will return to shortly. Who was actually in control of this situation? And were they controlling it wisely? The weeks between March and mid-April were marked by a series of diplomatic attempts, partial ceasefires, and significant miscommunications. On April 7th, the Trump administration announced a 2-week ceasefire brokered through Pakistan, and Iranian officials confirmed that the new supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the assassinated leader who was appointed by the Assembly of Experts on March 8th, had approved it. The ceasefire was supposed to involve the reopening of the strait. But what happened next illustrated just how fragile and complicated the situation had become. Iran did not simply reopen the waterway in the way the Trump administration had framed it. Instead, Tehran began controlling traffic through its own designated shipping channel north of Larak Island and began charging tolls of over $1 million per ship. In some cases, the toll reached $2 million. Lloyd's List reported that payments were being assessed in Chinese yuan. Ships from certain nations that had negotiated bilateral arrangements with Tehran, including China, Russia, India, Iraq, and Pakistan, were given passage. Others were not. The United States, which had framed the ceasefire as a breakthrough, was now watching Iran monetize the strait in real time. And critically, on April 9th, there was no sign that the agreed reopening was even being implemented in the way Washington had described. Ships were again being prevented from passing freely. The Trump administration's response came on April 12th. Vice President J.D. Vance, who had led the American delegation to peace talks in Islamabad, announced that negotiations had failed. The sticking point, Vance said, was Iran's refusal to provide an affirmative commitment that it would never seek a nuclear weapon. In the immediate aftermath of that announcement, President Trump declared a United States naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Not a selective enforcement, but a full blockade of all maritime traffic entering and exiting Iranian ports and coastal areas in the Arabian Gulf and Gulf of Oman. The United States Central Command deployed more than 10,000 troops, over a dozen Navy ships and fighter jets to enforce it. Oil prices jumped 7% in a single day, with Brent crude reaching $102 a barrel, a gain of 40% since the war began. WTI, the American benchmark, climbed to $104. American consumers were already paying an average of $4.11 per gallon for gasoline, up from $2.98 on February 28th. Here is where the analysis becomes genuinely important, and where we must be careful to separate what is verifiable from what is speculative. The blockade was legally contentious from the moment it was announced. Multiple international law experts noted that under the rules governing international straits, neither the United States nor Iran has the unilateral authority to close or block passage through the Strait of Hormuz. The blockade also created an immediate diplomatic problem with China and India, two major powers whose energy security depends directly on Persian Gulf oil flows. China called the blockade a dangerous and irresponsible act. Iranian parliamentary speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf warned publicly that Americans would soon be nostalgic for $4 gasoline, a pointed reference to what might come if the confrontation escalated further. Analysts at Capital Economics raised a pointed question. Would the American Navy actually seize or interdict Chinese vessels in the strait? Because if it did, that would represent an entirely different category of confrontation. The honest answer at that point was that nobody knew. And that uncertainty is itself enormously consequential for global markets and for the long-term architecture of American alliances. But then, today, something shifted. And it shifted in a way that does not fit the triumphalist narrative that the Trump administration is now presenting to the public. Let us be precise about the sequence of events because the details are important. Overnight, a 10-day ceasefire was agreed between Israel and Lebanon. The conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, which had escalated dramatically during the broader Iran war, had already killed more than 1,000 militants and civilians. The ceasefire, which required the disarmament of Hezbollah and the withdrawal of Israeli forces from southern Lebanon, appears to have created the diplomatic space for today's development. This morning, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi posted on social media that, and I am going to quote this precisely, "The passage for all commercial vessels through the Strait of Hormuz is declared completely open for the remaining period of the ceasefire, on the coordinated route as already announced by the Ports and Maritime Organization of the Islamic Republic of Iran." He added in a separate post that Iran had agreed to never close the Strait of Hormuz again. President Trump responded on social media, calling it a great and brilliant day for the world, expressing gratitude to Pakistan for its mediation role, and claiming that Iran, with the help of the United States, had removed or was removing all sea mines from the strait. He said that most of the main points of a broader deal are finalized and that an agreement would come quickly. Markets responded immediately. Brent crude fell more than 10% to under $89 a barrel. WTI dropped roughly 12% to around $83. Stocks surged globally. Shipping companies Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd welcomed the announcement cautiously, both noting that outstanding questions remain before they commit to resuming transit. Now here is where we must be honest about what is still unresolved, and where to be careful about premature declarations of victory. President Trump, in the same breath as welcoming the reopening, confirmed that the United States naval blockade of Iranian ports will remain in full force until a full peace deal is reached. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson, Esmail Baghai, responded by warning that if the blockade continues, Iran will take the necessary measures, and described the American position as contradictory. The Iranian side has made clear that its willingness to open the strait to commercial traffic was explicitly tied to reciprocal steps, including the lifting of the naval blockade. If those steps are not taken, the understanding frays. In Paris, French President Emmanuel Macron and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer convened an online summit today, attended by representatives of 49 countries, to discuss what they are calling a defensive multilateral mission to keep the strait secure going forward. Macron described Iran's announcement as moving in the right direction, while acknowledging that the American blockade remains a complicating factor. A planning meeting for the international mission is now scheduled to take place in London next week. What does all of this tell us? It tells us that today's development is genuinely significant and should be welcomed. The reopening of the strait, even temporarily, even conditionally, is good news for the global economy. The 12% drop in oil prices represents immediate relief for hundreds of millions of people who have been paying dramatically elevated energy costs for nearly 7 weeks. The prospect of a broader peace agreement, which Trump says is close, is a development worth taking seriously, even if the details remain opaque. But it is equally important to be clear about what today does not resolve. The nuclear question, which Vance identified as the core sticking point in Islamabad, has not been publicly addressed in today's announcements. We do not know, because it has not been confirmed in verified reporting, what specific commitments Iran has made on its nuclear program as part of this emerging framework. Trump told Reuters that the United States and Iran will work together to remove Iran's enriched uranium and bring it back to America. That is a significant claim, and it will require detailed verification. Until the terms of any final agreement are public and independently confirmed, the appropriate posture is cautious optimism, not celebration. There is also a broader strategic dimension that deserves honest examination. This war was launched on February 28th, while nuclear negotiations were still underway. That decision, regardless of the military justifications offered, had consequences that extended well beyond Iran's borders. The closure of the Strait of Hormuz inflicted enormous economic pain on nations that had no role in the dispute, particularly the most vulnerable economies in Asia, Africa, and the developing world. The IMF cut growth forecasts. Oil producers in the Gulf lost export revenue. Fertilizer shortages threaten food security in the spring planting season. These are not abstractions. They are measurable harms to real people in real countries. It is worth noting as well the precedent that the sustained blockade established. Multiple legal experts have stated that the American naval blockade of Iranian ports raises serious questions under international maritime law. The United States has, in effect, asserted the right to interdict the shipping lanes of all nations passing near Iranian territorial waters, including those of China, India, and other nations that were attempting to maintain access to energy supplies for their own populations. Whether that assertion of power will be challenged formally or informally in the months ahead is a question that will shape the diplomatic landscape for years to come. There is also a question worth raising openly, even if the answer is not yet knowable. Could this outcome, an Iran that has publicly committed to never closing the Strait of Hormuz again and that appears prepared to negotiate on nuclear matters, have been reached without the deaths of more than 3,000 people, the destruction of Iranian civilian infrastructure, including hospitals and cultural heritage sites, and the worst energy shock in recorded history? That is a question that historians and policymakers will debate extensively. The honest answer, based on what is publicly verifiable today, is that we do not know. What we do know is that the diplomatic pathway, which was interrupted by the strikes on February 28th while negotiations were still in progress, is now the pathway being pursued again. What we are watching today, then, is not a simple resolution. It is the beginning of a new and critical phase. The ceasefire in Lebanon is 10 days old. The ceasefire between the United States and Iran has not been formally declared, at least not in terms that have been publicly confirmed and verified. The naval blockade remains in force. Shipping companies are still assessing whether the security situation is stable enough to resume normal transit. And the broader peace deal, which Trump says is close, has not been signed, published, or independently verified. What should people take away from today? The reopening of the Strait of Hormuz is a meaningful step toward de-escalation, and the market reaction reflects that. An oil price that dropped 12% in an afternoon is the world's economy collectively exhaling after 7 weeks of compression. That matters. But a single social media post from an Iranian foreign minister and a celebratory statement from President Trump are not the same thing as a durable peace agreement. The gap between those two things is where the real risk still lives. Watch the naval blockade. If it is lifted in the coming days as part of a verified mutual agreement, that is a genuine signal of progress toward a stable resolution. If it remains in place while Iran's commitment to keep the strait open is expected to hold, that contradiction will create pressure. Watch whether the enriched uranium deal Trump described is confirmed and documented by independent inspectors. Watch whether the Lebanon ceasefire holds beyond its initial 10 days. And watch whether the 49 countries that gathered in Paris today around a multilateral framework for strait security coalesce into something durable or disperse when the immediate crisis eases. Today is, at minimum, the best news the global economy has received since February 28th. Oil at $83 is still above pre-war levels, but far below the $119 peak. The direction of travel is the right one. The structural questions, however, remain open. And the world that emerges from this conflict, with a new Iranian supreme leader, a permanently altered Middle Eastern security architecture, unprecedented American naval assertions in international waters, and a global energy system that has just experienced its worst shock in history, will require sustained, sober attention in the weeks and months ahead. The strait may be open today. The harder work of building something that keeps it open tomorrow has barely begun. If this breakdown helped you understand what is actually happening behind the headlines and what the real stakes are in this developing story, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We will be covering every development as the situation continues to unfold. Drop a comment below and tell us what you think. Is today a genuine turning point, or is this just another temporary pause in a conflict that is far from over?